Storyline Ontology is a data model that allows us to organise metadata about news content into a narrative, separating that narrative out from the things we produce, the video, the audio, the text, HTML, and putting it into a knowledge graph that we can then use to provide more interesting experiences to our audience, such as personalisation and better onward journeys, better linking, those kinds of things. The Storyline data model has a central class of the storyline, and an instance of a storyline has various literal properties, such as a title, a synopsis, a slug. Slug, by the way, has a particular meaning in the newsroom. It's typically a short label that's based on an understanding, a shared understanding of something that's in the news now. So it can benefit from disambiguation provided by a synopsis or some other sorts of literal properties. Then a storyline may have an attribution, which is the name of the journalist or team who put the storyline together, whose version of events is this basically. This can be particularly useful when we are comparing different media sources, so the BBC's version of what happened versus the Guardian's version of what happened versus the Daily Mail's version. Attribution is an important aspect of storyline. Topics are a way for us to associate storylines with identifiers for real-world entities, people, places, organisations, etc. And we might say, for example, the storyline of the funeral of Nelson Mandela has the topic of Nelson Mandela, the topic of South Africa, the topic of apartheid. And that lets us provide links to other related storylines. So we can say that this storyline is the storyline of, for example, the election of South Africa's first black president, also has the topic of Nelson Mandela in South Africa. And that shared graph can be presented back to an audience as a way of discovering more content from news, especially from the news archive. Storylines can form quite complex narratives, and the model allows for that with the storyline slot class. Storyline slots are a way for us to describe the relationship between events in a storyline. So we might say that the first slot contains a particular event, the second slot contains another event, and so on. These could be represented in a linear timeline, or they could be represented in a more interesting journalistic sort of fashion. So you might argue that the event in slot 1 was causal to the event in slot 2, or gave rise to, or whatever kind of assertion we want to make about the relationship between those events. Storyline slots contain a superclass or an interface class called storyline component, and that's basically a way for us to allow a storyline to contain other storylines as well as containing events. That's useful if you're describing a long-running storyline such as the Syria crisis, for example, where you might have a separate group of events around the chemical weapons situation and a separate group of events around the siege of Homs. So for NewsHack 2, we're introducing some new predicates. Predicates are the parts of the data that we're collecting that associate a piece of content with a linked data topic or storyline. So for example, instead of just saying this piece of content is about this storyline, we might say this piece of content is analysis of this storyline, or is a quote attributed to a person about this storyline, or is an explainer. Starting with NewsHack 2, we're introducing a range of new predicates that allow us to make more semantically meaningful statements about the relationship between the content and the storyline. So for example, you might have a stream of content which was all about a storyline in chronological order. However, you could pull out the explainers or the analysis or the sort of editorial picks, if you like, the things which you particularly want to draw to the audience's attention, and give those a special treatment on your front-end application.